I had just set the lobster cooler down on the porch when my sister-in-law wrinkled her nose and said it looked sad. "Where are the big ones, Marin? These look like they haven't even finished growing." I stood there in my coat, snow still melting off my boots, holding the receipt in my pocket like proof I could pull out if anyone actually wanted the truth. 40 pounds of live Nova Scotia lobster, picked up that morning from the wharf in Hubbard's, packed in seaweed and ice, still snapping their bands when I loaded them into the trunk. I'd gotten up at 5 to drive out there because my mother-in-law had specifically said, weeks ago, that nothing impresses her brother's family like proper lobster, the kind you can't get from a grocery store. And now Teresa was looking at the cooler the way you'd look at something the cat dragged in. My mother-in-law, Glenys, came around the corner from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, took one look, and her face did that thing it always did when she'd already decided to be disappointed before she even had the facts. "Those are small," she said. "Not a question. They're 1.5 pounds each, Glenys. That's a good size for." Howard's bringing his business partner, the Whitfields. You know what kind of money that family has. We can't serve them lobster that looks like an afterthought. She crossed her arms. "Take them back. Exchange them for something bigger. You have time before everyone gets here." I want to tell you I said something clever in that moment. I didn't. I looked at the cooler, then at Teresa standing there with her arms crossed exactly like her mother's, then back at the kitchen window where I could see my husband's father, Walter, sitting at the table reading the paper, like none of this concerned him, the way it never did. I'd been married to their son for 9 years. 9 Thanksgivings, 9 Christmases, 9 of these kitchens where I was somehow always either too much or not enough. I'd learned a long time ago that arguing with Glenys was like arguing with weather. You didn't win, you just got wet, so I bent down, picked the cooler back up, the ice shifting and the claws scratching against the styrofoam, and I said, "Okay, that was it, just okay." I carried it back to my car, set it in the trunk, and drove off. And I'm not going to lie and tell you I had some grand plan forming in my head right then, some quiet revenge brewing like a kettle. I didn't. I was just tired. Bone tired in a way that had nothing to do with the 5 a.m. wake-up. I drove for about 10 minutes before I even knew where I was going, and then I realized my hands had already turned the wheel toward my mother's place out in Bedford, 20 minutes the other direction, and I just kept driving. My name is Marin. I'm 38. I work as a claims adjuster for an insurance firm in Halifax, and at the time all this happened, I'd been married to Howard for 9 years. We had a 6-year-old, Poppy, who that day was at her aunt's for a sleepover, blissfully unaware that her mother was currently driving 40 pounds of lobster in the wrong direction. Howard is a good man, mostly. I want to say that clearly, because what I'm about to tell you might make him sound otherwise, and that's not fair to him. He's steady, he's never raised his voice at me in 9 years. He remembers our anniversary without being reminded. But he has one blind spot the exact size and shape of his mother, and it's been there since before I met him. Probably since before he could walk. The Whitfield dinner had been the subject of family group texts for 2 weeks straight. Howard's father, Walter, had retired from a logistics company last spring and was, depending on who you asked, either consulting or extremely bored, and somewhere in there he'd reconnected with an old colleague, Don Whitfield, who now ran some import business out of Dartmouth. There was talk, vague and never quite specified, of Walter coming on as a partner, of money changing hands, of opportunity. Glenys had decided this dinner needed to look a certain way. Tablecloths ironed, good china, and lobster, because apparently in her mind nothing said, "We are a serious, prosperous family," quite like shellfish. I'd offered to help with the menu 3 weeks ago and gotten exactly one instruction. Lobster, the bigger the better, and don't skimp. I hadn't skimped. I'd spent $420 of our joint account on lobster that morning, plus gas money driving 40 minutes each way to the Good Wharf instead of the overpriced fish counter at the superstore, because I wanted, for once, to walk into that house and have nobody find a single thing to criticize. You'd think after 9 years I'd know better than to want that. The thing about Glenys is she's not a cruel woman, not in any way you could point to and call abuse. She's never screamed at me, she's never said anything truly unforgivable. What she does is smaller and somehow worse. She finds the one flaw in anything you bring her, the one crack in anything you do, and she presses on it, gently in front of an audience, until you feel about 2 inches tall. The lobster being small wasn't really about the lobster. It had never been about the actual thing. 3 Christmases ago, it had been the wine I'd brought. Interesting choice. And she'd opened a different bottle in front of everyone. 2 summers ago, it was the dress I wore to Walter's 60th. Brave with your figure. Always delivered light, almost affectionate, so that if I ever reacted, I'd be the one who seemed unreasonable. Howard's sister Teresa had learned the same trick from their mother, just with less finesse. She was 34, unmarried, still living in the basement apartment of her parents' house in Clayton Park, and she had opinions about my parenting, my career, my haircut, and apparently now my shellfish. I used to go home after these dinners and cry quietly in the bathroom with the fan running so Howard wouldn't hear. And then I'd come out and tell him I was fine. I stopped doing that about a year ago, not because it got easier, but because I think something in me went a little numb instead, which in hindsight might have been worse. When I pulled into my mother's driveway with the cooler still in the trunk, she came out onto the step in her cardigan, took one look at my face, and didn't ask a single question. She just said, "Bring it in, I'll put the kettle on," like I'd shown up with groceries instead of a small crisis. My mother, Brenda, is 71, widowed 8 years now, and lives alone in the house I grew up in, the one with the crooked storm door that never quite latches right in winter. She'd never been Glennis's biggest fan, mostly because she'd watched, over 9 years, the particular way I went quiet after every family dinner, the way I'd come over the next day and not quite be myself for a few hours. I set the cooler on her kitchen floor and just stood there. "They wanted bigger," I finally said. "I drove out to Hubbard's this morning. 40 pounds. And she took one look and told me to exchange them because the Whitfields are coming." My mother looked into the cooler, at the lobsters shifting against each other, claws still banded, very much alive, very much not small by any normal standard. "These are beautiful lobster, Marin." "I know. So what are you going to do? Drive all the way back out to Hubbard's and try to find something bigger before 5 o'clock. And this is the part where I surprised myself, because the answer came out of me before I'd even fully thought it. "No," I said. "I'm going to leave them here. We're having lobster for dinner tonight. You and me and Poppy when Teresa drops her back." My mother looked at me for a long moment, the way she used to look at me when I was 16, and about to do something she wasn't sure she should stop me from doing. "And what do you tell Howard's mother?" "Nothing. Let her wonder." I want to be honest with you about what was going through my head, because it wasn't some triumphant feeling. It wasn't satisfaction. It was mostly just exhaustion, the kind that makes you stop calculating consequences because you're too tired to care anymore. I'd spent 9 years smoothing things over, translating Glennie's to Howard in a softer language, so he wouldn't have to confront what his mother actually said, absorbing comments so they wouldn't land on Poppy, showing up early to help set tables so there'd be one less thing to criticize. And that afternoon, standing in my mother's kitchen with 40 pounds of perfectly good lobster between us, something in me just declined to keep doing the math. I texted Howard around 2. Took the lobster to Mom's, not going back out to exchange it. I'll explain later. No emoji, no excuse, nothing for him to argue with yet. Then I turned my phone over on the counter and helped my mother get a pot big enough for the job out of the cellar. He called 40 minutes later. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I picked up the third time. "What's going on?" His voice had that careful, worried husband tone, the one that meant he hadn't yet decided whether to be sympathetic or frustrated, and wanted to gather information before committing. "Your mother told me to exchange 40 pounds of perfectly good lobster because the Whitfields are coming. I'm not doing it." "Okay, but Marin, the dinner's at 6. People are already on their way. What are we supposed to serve?" "I don't know, Howard. What did people do before I started doing all the shopping?" There was a silence on the line that told me he didn't have an answer to that, because the honest answer was that nobody else ever did the shopping. Not really. Not the kind that took an entire morning and $400 and getting up at 5. "Can you at least come back? We'll figure out the lobster thing later, they're going to be here in 3 hours. I'm staying at Mom's tonight. Poppy too, once Teresa drops her off." I paused, and then because I couldn't quite stop myself, I added, "Tell your mother I hope the Whitfields like whatever's in the freezer." I hung up before he could respond to that, which I'm not proud of, but I also wasn't sorry. My mother and I spent the next hour doing what I hadn't done in longer than I wanted to admit. Just being in a kitchen together. Without an audience, without anyone counting how much butter I used or commenting on whether I was doing it the right way. She put on the radio, some classic rock station she'd listened to since I was a kid, and we got the big pot going and the whole house started to smell like the ocean. And for the first time that day, I felt my shoulders come down from somewhere up around my ears. Teresa dropped Poppy off around 4:30, and I watched my daughter run into her grandmother's kitchen and immediately start narrating, the way 6-year-olds do, every single thing that had happened at her sleepover, completely unbothered by the underlying tension radiating off every adult in the room. Teresa lingered in the doorway for a second, looking at the pot on the stove, the smell unmistakable. "Is that? Yep, Mom's going to lose it. She already did," That's why I'm here. Theresa didn't say anything else. She just sort of nodded, in a way I couldn't quite read, and left. The first text from Glennis came in around 5:15. Where are the new lobsters? The Whitfields will be here soon. I didn't answer. 5:40. Marin, this isn't funny. We have nothing for dinner. Still didn't answer. 6:05, the call. I let it ring twice and then, mostly because Poppy asked who was calling, I picked up. Glennis's voice came through sharp and fast, none of the light performative tone she usually used in front of people. Where are the crabs? The lobsters? Where are they? Howard said you took them and never came back. The Whitfields are sitting at the table right now. What am I supposed to serve them? The seafood counter is closed. Everything is closed. I let her run out of steam before I answered. They're at my mother's. We're having them for dinner. You took our dinner to your mother's house? I bought the lobster, Glennis. With my money. You told me to take it back and exchange it. I did take it back. I just didn't bring it to you. There was a silence on the other end that felt very satisfying, and then she said, in a voice that had gone tight and strange, You can't be serious. This is Marin. The Whitfields are sitting at my table right now. Then I'd suggest checking the freezer, or ordering something. There's a good Vietnamese place that delivers out your way, I think. Poppy and I are about to eat. I hung up. My hands were shaking a little, not from fear exactly, more from the strange unfamiliar feeling of having said a true thing out loud to a woman I'd spent 9 years carefully managing. What I found out later, and I only got this in pieces, partly from Howard, partly from Theresa, who it turned out had her own complicated feelings about her mother that she'd never said out loud before that night, was that the scene at Glennis's and Walter's house had been close to a disaster. There'd been nothing in the freezer beyond some chicken thighs and a bag of peas. Walter, mortified in front of Don Whitfield, the man he was hoping might hand him a business opportunity worth real money, had ended up driving out himself to a grocery store that was somehow still open, coming back with a rotisserie chicken and a bag of dinner rolls, while Glennis tried to spin the whole thing into a joke about keeping things casual that nobody at the table quite bought. Don Whitfield, by every account I got afterward, had been perfectly gracious about it, the way people with real money often are about small things, because small things have never had to matter to them. But Walter had been quiet and short with Glennis for the rest of the night, and at some point, Theresa told me this part with something almost like glee. He'd said, loud enough for everyone to hear, maybe if you hadn't sent perfectly good lobster back, we wouldn't be eating a grocery store chicken in front of Don. Meanwhile, at my mother's table, Poppy was wearing a plastic bib with a cartoon lobster on it that had been mine when I was her age, cracking open claws with a little wooden mallet, butter dripping down her chin, telling my mother a long and detailed story about a girl in her class, who apparently had a hamster that escaped during nap time. My mother laughed in a way I hadn't heard in months. I sat there with a glass of the white wine she'd had chilling in the fridge, picking meat out of a claw, and felt something in my chest loosen that had been tight for longer than I could properly account for. Howard showed up at my mother's around 8:30. I heard his car before I saw him, and my mother gave me a look that said she'd let him in, but she wasn't going to make this easy for him. He stood in the kitchen doorway looking like a man who'd aged a few years in one evening, and Poppy ran over and hugged his legs, completely oblivious, and he picked her up and held onto her a beat longer than usual. Can we talk? He said to me, over Poppy's head. We went out onto my mother's back porch, the one with the crooked storm door, and stood there in the cold for a minute before either of us said anything. My mother's pretty upset, he started. I imagine she is. The Whitfield thing was important. You know that. I do know that. That's why I drove 40 minutes out to Hubbard's at 5 in the morning to get good lobster. That's why I spent $400 on it. I did the work, Howard. I did exactly what your mother asked. And she still found a way to make it not good enough, in front of your sister, like she always does, and I am so tired of being the only person in this family who's expected to just absorb that and keep smiling. He didn't say anything for a second, then, quieter. You've known that for 9 years. You've never once said anything to her about it. Not once. What was I supposed to say? I don't know, Howard. Something. Anything. Mom, that's not fair to my wife. That's it. That's the whole sentence. I'm not asking you to disown her. He looked down at the porch boards, and I watched something shift across his face, like he was finally doing some arithmetic he'd been avoiding for years. Tonight was bad, he admitted. Dad's pretty rattled. He thinks he might have embarrassed himself in front of Dawn. That's not actually about me, Howard. That's about a choice your mother made. I know. He rubbed the back of his neck, a habit he'd had since I met him, the thing he does when he's cornered by a truth he doesn't like. I think I've spent a long time just trying to keep the peace between you two, and I think what that actually meant was I kept asking you to do all the bending. That was the first time in 9 years he'd said anything close to that out loud. And I felt something behind my eyes that I wasn't going to let go of in front of him, not yet. I'm not coming back tonight, I said. Poppy and I are staying at Mom's. I need a night where nobody's measuring anything I did against some invisible standard I was never told about. He nodded slowly. Okay, that's fair. Then after a pause, I'm sorry about today. I should have backed you up on the phone instead of asking you to come fix it. It wasn't a full apology, not for 9 years worth of things, but it was more than he'd ever given me before. And on a cold porch in November, with the smell of butter and lobster still drifting out from the kitchen window, it was enough to work with. I didn't go back to Glennis's house for almost 3 weeks after that, not out of spite exactly, more because I genuinely didn't know what I'd say to her, and I wasn't ready to perform the usual smoothing over that I always did. The thing where I showed up and acted like nothing had happened, so everyone else could be comfortable. When I finally did see her, it was at a small family lunch Howard arranged, very deliberately, at a restaurant instead of her house, neutral ground. She was stiffer than usual, less performative, and at one point while Howard and Walter were talking about something else entirely, she said to me, quietly, almost like it cost her something, the lobster was a generous thing to bring. I shouldn't have said what I said. It wasn't a grand apology. Glennis doesn't do grand. But it was real, in its small, clipped, very Glennis way, and I decided to let it be enough, because I'd learned something that fall that I hadn't fully understood before. That you don't have to win a war with someone like her, you just have to stop volunteering to lose quietly. Walter, for his part, ended up not going into business with Don Whitfield at all. Something about the numbers not working out the way he'd hoped. But he and Don stayed friendly. And Walter told that story about the rotisserie chicken at every family gathering for the next year, always laughing harder than anyone, and always glancing at me when he got to the part about the lobster, like it was our private joke now. I still buy lobster every Thanksgiving. Good ones, from the same wharf in Hubbard's. But these days I buy exactly enough for the people who'll actually appreciate it, and not 1 pound more. And if anyone ever tells me it looks small, I already know exactly where I'm driving it instead.